It was a quiet autumn afternoon in Princeton when I first heard the story of David Lewis strolling into a modest coffee shop on Nassau Street, a notebook tucked under his arm, his mind already humming with the equations of possibility. The shop was dim, the air scented with roasted beans, and across the table sat a young Saul Kripke, his eyebrows furrowed over a fresh draft of modal logic. Their conversation, according to those who were present, began with a simple question. What does it mean for something to be possible? Lewis, ever the meticulous scholar, placed his cup down, stared at the steam curling upward, and replied, "It means there is a world, another concrete reality, where that very state of affairs obtains." The debate that followed stretched for hours, each remark punctuated by the clink of porcelain. Each counter-example a ripple across the surface of a theory that would later become known as modal realism. In that moment, the seeds of a metaphysical vision were sown, a vision that would grow from the fertile ground of his early life in New Jersey, through the halls of Harvard and Oxford, and into the very fabric of contemporary analytic philosophy. David Kellogg Lewis was born on September the 22nd of 1941 in the industrial suburb of Newark, New Jersey. His father, a modest accountant, and his mother, a schoolteacher, nurtured a household where curiosity was rewarded and books were never far from reach. Young David, often called Dave by his friends, spent his evenings poring over the pages of Euclid and the collected works of Bertrand Russell, his mind already attuned to the precise language of mathematics and logic. He later recalled in an interview, "I was fascinated by the way a single symbol could carry an entire world of meaning." This early fascination would become a cornerstone of his intellectual trajectory, guiding him toward a path where language, logic, and the structure of reality would intertwine. At the age of 17, Lewis earned a scholarship to Harvard University, a place that would become the crucible for his emerging philosophical identity. Harvard in the early 1960s was a bustling arena of intellectual ferment, a place where the analytic tradition was both revered and challenged. It was there that Lewis first encountered the towering figure of W.V.O. Quine, whose lectures on naturalism and the rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction left an indelible mark on the young scholar. Quine's insistence that philosophy must be continuous with the empirical sciences resonated deeply with Lewis. In a letter to a colleague, Lewis wrote, "Quine taught me that the only way to speak meaningfully about the world is to adopt the language of science, to let our concepts be shaped by the best empirical theories we have." This commitment to scientific realism would later become a defining feature of his metaphysical system. Yet Quine was not the sole influence that shaped Lewis's early thought. The legacy of Rudolf Carnap, the leading exponent of logical positivism, loomed large over the Harvard philosophy department. Carnap's rigorous analysis of language, his emphasis on logical syntax, and his project of reconstructing philosophy on a formal basis offered a template that Lewis would both emulate and transcend. While Carnap sought to eliminate metaphysics altogether, Lewis saw in his formalism a tool, a set of logical instruments that could be turned toward metaphysical ends rather than away from them. He once remarked, "Carnap gave us the grammar, I wanted to write the story." This subtle shift from elimination to construction signaled the beginning of a new direction, one that would ultimately lead him to propose a universe populated by countless concrete worlds. The transition from Harvard to Oxford marked another pivotal chapter. In 1964, Lewis crossed the Atlantic to become a junior fellow at New College, Oxford, a fellowship that placed him in close contact with the British analytic tradition. There he met Michael Dummett, a philosopher whose deep concern for the philosophy of language and the foundations of mathematics offered a contrasting perspective to the American naturalism that had shaped Lewis's earlier years. Dummett's work on the theory of meaning, particularly his defense of the verificationist approach, forced Lewis to sharpen his own views on the relationship between language and reality. In a conversation recounted by a mutual friend, Dummett asked, "If we speak of possible worlds, are we not merely using a convenient fiction?" Lewis, with his characteristic calm, replied, "A fiction perhaps, but one that can be made as rigorous as any mathematical theorem." Their dialogue, though friendly, highlighted a fundamental divergence. Dummett's emphasis on the epistemic conditions of meaning versus Lewis's confidence that metaphysical commitments could be grounded in the same logical rigor that underpinned scientific theories. Around the same time, Hilary Putnam, another towering figure of the era, entered the narrative. Putnam's work on the philosophy of mind and his famous twin Earth thought experiment introduced a new way of thinking about reference and meaning across possible worlds. Lewis, ever attentive to the nuances of language, found in Putnam's thought experiment a fertile ground for his own developing ideas. He wrote in a draft of his later book, On the Plurality of Worlds, that Putnam's twin Earth provides a vivid illustration of how a single term can refer to distinct entities in different worlds, thereby giving concrete content to the notion of possible worlds. While Putnam eventually moved away from a literal interpretation of possible worlds, favoring a more abstract, semantic approach, Lewis remained steadfast, arguing that the worlds of his theory were not merely linguistic devices, but actual, concrete entities. This tension between Putnam's semantic realism and Lewis's ontological realism would become a recurring theme in the debates that followed. Lewis's temperament, often described by colleagues as calm, meticulous, and almost shy, played a crucial role in shaping his methodological rigor. He was not a firebrand who shouted from the podium. Rather, he preferred the quiet of his office, the steady tap of a fountain pen on paper, and the slow, deliberate construction of arguments. Those who worked alongside him noted his habit of revisiting a proof multiple times, each iteration peeling away a layer of ambiguity until only the essential structure remained. This patience is evident in his early papers, such as Counterpart Theory and Quantified Modal Logic, where he painstakingly develops a framework that would later become a cornerstone of his modal metaphysics. In a recollection by a former graduate student, she said, Dave would spend an entire afternoon checking a single line of a proof, not because he doubted its correctness, but because he believed that true understanding required that every step be as clear as a crystal. This relentless pursuit of clarity would become a hallmark of his later, more expansive works. The coffee shop debate with Kripke, though often recounted with a hint of legend, offers a vivid illustration of Lewis's method. Kripke, armed with his nascent ideas about rigid designators and the necessity of identity, challenged Lewis to defend a view that seemed, at first glance, to multiply reality beyond any reasonable limit. Lewis responded by invoking the notion of concrete possible worlds, each a full-fledged, spatiotemporally extended reality. He argued that just as the physical world contains countless particles, it could also contain countless worlds, each as concrete as our own. The conversation, according to witnesses, was marked by a series of pauses where both philosophers seemed to weigh the weight of each claim, the clatter of cups punctuating their thoughts. In the end, Kripke conceded that, while he found the ontology extravagant, the logical consistency of Lewis's system was undeniable. The episode encapsulated a central feature of Lewis's philosophy, a willingness to entertain bold ontological commitments, provided they could be rendered with the same logical precision that guided his analysis of language. 3 years later, in the spring of 1973, Lewis stood before a packed auditorium at Princeton University, delivering a lecture that would ignite what later became known as the modal realist controversy. The lecture, titled The Nature of Possibility, was more than a presentation of a new theory. It was a call to re-examine the foundations of metaphysics. He began in his measured voice with a simple yet provocative statement: there are many worlds, each of which is a complete and concrete reality. The room fell silent, the weight of those words hanging in the air. Students and faculty alike whispered among themselves, some amused, others bewildered. The controversy that followed was swift and fierce. Critics accused Lewis of ontological extravagance, while supporters praised his boldness and the elegance of his formalism. In the weeks that followed, letters flooded the philosophy department, journals published rebuttals, and a lively debate unfolded across campuses. Lewis, however, remained composed. In a later interview, he reflected, "The reaction taught me that the true test of a theory is not whether it is comfortable, but whether it can be defended with the same rigor we apply to any scientific hypothesis." The 1973 lecture thus marked a turning point, solidifying his reputation as a thinker unafraid to push the boundaries of what metaphysics could entail. To understand why Lewis felt compelled to propose such a sweeping ontology, one must return to his early commitments to language, logic, and scientific realism. The analytic tradition, with its emphasis on clarity and argumentative precision, had taught him that philosophical problems could often be dissolved, or at least clarified, by attending to the logical form of our statements. Quine's naturalism had impressed upon him that any philosophical theory must be compatible with the best available science. And Carnap's formalism had shown him that the tools of symbolic logic could be harnessed to build intricate structures that mirrored the complexity of the world. Lewis saw these influences converging in a single insight, that the space of possibilities, far from being a mere linguistic convenience, could be given a robust, concrete existence that would make sense of modal discourse, counterfactual reasoning, and the semantics of natural language. In his own words from a draft of his later book, he wrote, "If we are to talk about what could have been, we must have a domain in which those alternatives truly exist." This conviction became the cornerstone of what would later be called modal realism. The interplay between Lewis's temperament and his intellectual environment also shaped his methodological approach. Unlike some of his contemporaries who embraced a more phenomenological or existential tone, Lewis preferred a systematic, almost engineering-like mindset. He treated philosophical problems as puzzles to be solved, each piece fitting into a larger, coherent structure. His meticulous nature meant that he would often draft multiple versions of a paper, each revision tightening the arguments, eliminating ambiguities, and anticipating objections. This habit is evident in the evolution of his counterpart theory. In early drafts, he explored a more naive version of the theory, but through careful reflection, often prompted by correspondence with friends like Robert Stalnaker, he refined the notion of counterparts to avoid the pitfalls of identity across worlds. He once wrote to Stalnaker, "I am convinced that the notion of a strict identity between individuals in distinct worlds leads to contradictions. We must instead think in terms of similarity relations that preserve the relevant properties." Such exchanges reveal a collaborative, yet deeply personal, process of philosophical development. Cross-references to other thinkers of his generation further illuminate the distinctive shape of Lewis's thought. Hilary Putnam, as mentioned, offered a semantic route to possible worlds that emphasized their role as tools for interpreting language. Putnam's later turn toward internal realism, where truth is understood relative to a conceptual scheme, contrasted sharply with Lewis's externalist stance. While Putnam argued that the world is not a fixed backdrop but a tapestry woven from our conceptual frameworks, Lewis maintained that the tapestry exists independently of any framework, and our concepts merely discover its pattern. Michael Dummett, on the other hand, was deeply concerned with the verification conditions of meaning, especially in the context of intuitionistic logic. Dummett's skepticism about the metaphysical import of possible worlds stood in stark relief against Lewis's confidence that worlds could be treated as concrete entities. Yet both shared a common commitment to the precision of language and the importance of logical analysis, a shared ground that made their disagreements all the more intellectually fruitful. Even within the American analytic tradition, Lewis found allies and interlocutors. Robert Nozick, a fellow student at Harvard and later a prominent philosopher of mind and political theory, engaged Lewis in discussions about the nature of personal identity across possible worlds. Nozick's experience machine thought experiment, though primarily aimed at ethics, raised questions about the criteria for personal continuity, a theme that Lewis would later explore through his counterpart theory. Their debates, often conducted over late-night meals in Cambridge, revealed a mutual respect for each other's rigor, even as they diverged on the metaphysical commitments required to answer such questions. Nozick once quipped, "Dave, you give us a multiverse of possibilities. I merely ask whether any of them feel like home." Lewis's reply, delivered with his characteristic calm, was, "If they are worlds as concrete as ours, then they have the same right to be called home as any other." The influence of Quine, however, remained a persistent thread throughout Lewis's career. Quine's rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction, his holistic view of knowledge, and his insistence on the continuity between philosophy and science provided Lewis with a philosophical scaffolding. In a 1970 essay, Lewis explicitly invoked Quine's naturalism, writing, "If we accept that our theories are underdetermined by experience, then the choice of a metaphysical framework must be guided by considerations of explanatory power, coherence, and fit with the best empirical science." This alignment with Quine's pragmatic approach allowed Lewis to defend his modal realism not as an arbitrary metaphysical extravagance, but as a theory that offered unparalleled explanatory depth for counterfactuals, the semantics of modal statements, and the structure of scientific laws. Yet Lewis's path was not without its critics. The modal realist controversy of the 1970s produced a cascade of responses. Saul Kripke, despite their earlier coffee shop camaraderie, emerged as one of the most vocal opponents. In his Naming and Necessity lectures, Kripke introduced the notion of rigid designators, terms that refer to the same object in every possible world, and argued that such designators made the existence of concrete possible worlds unnecessary. He famously claimed, "We can talk about possible worlds without committing ourselves to their concrete existence." Lewis, ever the careful interlocutor, responded by pointing out that rigid designators presuppose a domain of worlds in which the designators have fixed reference. In his reply, he wrote, "The very notion of a rigid designator presupposes a landscape of worlds where the referent remains invariant. To deny the existence of that landscape is to undermine the concept itself." Their exchange, published in various philosophy journals, became a classic illustration of how two brilliant minds could diverge sharply while still respecting each other's intellectual integrity. Another prominent critic, Peter van Inwagen, approached Lewis's modal realism from the angle of ontological economy. Van Inwagen, a staunch proponent of ontological parsimony, argued that positing an infinite number of concrete worlds violated the principle of ontological thrift. He famously wrote, "We should not multiply entities beyond necessity. A single world suffices for the purposes of science and everyday discourse." Lewis, rather than dismissing this concern outright, engaged it directly. He argued that the cost of ontological extravagance must be weighed against the explanatory benefits. In a series of lectures, he presented a cost-benefit analysis. The ability of modal realism to provide a unified account of counterfactuals, the semantics of modal logic, and the metaphysics of properties justified the ontological commitment. He concluded, if a theory can illuminate a wide range of phenomena, then its ontological price may be well worth paying. This pragmatic balancing act, reminiscent of Quine's naturalism, underscored Lewis's willingness to entertain bold metaphysical commitments when they served a broader explanatory agenda. Beyond the heated debates, Lewis's personal life offered subtle yet significant influences on his philosophical outlook. He married his longtime friend, the literary scholar Ellen, whose interests in narrative theory and the structure of stories sparked occasional forays for Lewis into the philosophy of language that bordered on the literary. In a letter to Ellen, he mused, "Stories are in a sense maps of possible worlds. Each plotline explores a path that might have been taken." This metaphor, though casual, foreshadowed his later use of possible worlds as narrative devices, a move that would later inspire philosophers of fiction such as David Hume's modern interpreters. His calm demeanor, often noted by colleagues, was not a lack of passion but a cultivated discipline. He once explained to a graduate student, "Philosophy, for me, is a meditation. It requires the patience to sit with a problem, to let its contours emerge slowly, like a landscape revealed through mist." This reflective habit manifested in the careful pacing of his arguments, the deliberate structuring of his books, and the measured tone of his lectures. The historical context of the 1960s and early 1970s also played a role in shaping Lewis's ambitions. The era was marked by a resurgence of interest in the foundations of mathematics, the rise of formal semantics in linguistics, and the burgeoning field of computer science. The development of possible world semantics by philosophers such as Angelica Kratzer and linguists like Montague offered a practical framework for interpreting natural language. Lewis recognized that his metaphysical proposal could dovetail with these advances, providing a robust ontological backdrop for the semantics that were being formalized in linguistics. In a talk at the Linguistic Society of America, he noted, "When we assign truth conditions to modal statements, we are implicitly appealing to a domain of worlds. Why not make that domain explicit, concrete, and subject to the same logical analysis as any other entity?" This cross-disciplinary awareness further cemented his belief that a comprehensive metaphysics must be compatible with developments across the intellectual spectrum. The influence of earlier philosophers also cannot be what does it mean to say that every way the universe could have been is, in a very literal sense, a world that actually exists. When David Lewis first articulated his bold claim, he was not merely offering a clever metaphor for imagination. He was proposing a radical ontology, a picture of reality in which the possible worlds of modal logic are not abstract, linguistic devices, but concrete, spatiotemporally isolated realms. Each as fully fleshed out as the one we call the actual world. To grasp the weight of this proposal, we must begin by unpacking the formal definition Lewis gives to a world, and then follow the thread through the distinctions he draws between actual and possible, the role of the indexical term actual, and the sweeping implications that ripple outward into philosophy, physics, and everyday reasoning. Lewis starts with a simple, almost austere description. A possible world is a maximal, consistent set of propositions, a complete way things could be, and it is itself a concrete entity. In his own words, a world is a spatio-temporal whole that is like our own world, except that it may differ in its particular facts. The key word here is maximal. For any given world, there is no further proposition that could be added without creating a contradiction. Think of a world as a perfectly completed jigsaw puzzle. Every piece is in place, every gap filled, and the picture is fixed. The world is not a mere collection of possibilities. It is a full-fledged, self-contained reality, with its own objects, its own laws of nature, its own histories, its own individuals. In this picture, the universe we inhabit is simply one world among an unimaginably vast multitude, each world standing apart like islands in a boundless ocean of existence. The term actual in Lewis's system is an indexical, much like here or now. When we say the actual world, we are not making a metaphysical claim that our world is privileged in some absolute sense. Rather, we are using the word actual to point to the world that we, as speakers, happen to inhabit. Lewis writes, actual is an indexical term, analogous to I or here. It picks out the world that the speaker is in. This subtle shift dissolves the temptation to treat actual as a property that makes our world unique. Instead, it becomes a linguistic convenience. We speak of the actual world because it is the world we experience, not because it is ontologically superior. From this starting point, Lewis builds a sophisticated machinery for interpreting modal statements, statements about what is possible, necessary, or contingent. When we say, for instance, it is possible that Napoleon won at Waterloo, we are not merely expressing a hypothetical. In Lewis's framework, we are asserting that there exists at least one possible world, a concrete spatio-temporal totality, in which the Battle of Waterloo ends with Napoleon's triumph. The truth of that modal claim is grounded in the existence of a world that matches the description. Likewise, when we claim, it is necessary that 2 plus 2 equals 4, we are saying that in every possible world, the arithmetic truth holds. Necessity, then, is a universal quantification over all worlds, while possibility is an existential quantification. Let us pause for a moment and consider two vivid illustrations that Lewis himself would have welcomed. First, imagine a world in which Napoleon's forces, bolstered by an unexpected alliance with Prussia, outmaneuver the British and Dutch troops, securing a decisive victory at Waterloo. In that world, the cascade of historical consequences, perhaps a longer Napoleonic empire, a delayed rise of British industrial dominance, a different map of colonial holdings, unfolds as a matter of concrete fact. The world is not a story we tell. It is a fully realized spatio-temporal whole, complete with its own Napoleonic soldiers, its own French bureaucracy, its own version of the art and literature that would emerge under a prolonged empire. Second, picture a world where the laws of physics are such that perpetual motion machines can be built. In this world, the principle of conservation of energy, as we understand it, does not hold. Engineers have harnessed a source of inexhaustible energy, and societies have organized themselves around a technology that eliminates scarcity of power. The climate, the economics, the very metaphysics of causation in that world differ profoundly from ours. Yet for Lewis, this world is no more speculative than the one we occupy. It simply has a different set of physical facts. These examples are not mere flights of fancy. They illustrate the central explanatory power of modal realism. Modal statements become statements about the existence of concrete worlds. This move allows philosophers to treat possibility and necessity with the same ontological tools we use for ordinary existence. It also opens the door to a host of applications, both within philosophy and beyond. In the realm of philosophy of language, for instance, Lewis's framework offers a natural semantics for the counterfactuals that dominate everyday discourse. When we say, if the match had been struck, the fire would have started, we are implicitly quantifying over worlds that are like ours up to the point of the match being struck, and then diverge in the way the fire behaves. The truth conditions for such a statement can be precisely captured by looking at the nearest possible worlds where the antecedent holds. This approach, refined through the work of Robert Stalnaker and others, has become a cornerstone of modern modal semantics, influencing how we understand conditionals in linguistics, law, and artificial intelligence. In decision theory, the notion of possible worlds undergirds the analysis of expected utility. When an agent evaluates a gamble, she imagines a range of outcomes. Each outcome corresponds to a possible world where the gamble yields a particular payoff. The agent's preferences over these worlds, together with a probability distribution, determine rational choice. Lewis's concrete ontology supplies a metaphysical grounding for these imagined worlds, allowing us to speak of them as real alternatives rather than mere figments of imagination. Even in ethics, modal realism finds a foothold. Consider the debate over moral luck, the idea that factors beyond an agent's control can affect moral judgment. By appealing to possible worlds, one can articulate the intuition that an agent's moral status should be evaluated across the spectrum of worlds where the same choices are made under different circumstances. The concrete existence of these worlds gives weight to the claim that moral evaluation is not confined to a single, actual history. Of course, such an expansive ontology does not go unchallenged. Two of the most persistent objections target the very core of Lewis's claim. The first is the ontological extravagance objection. Critics ask, why should we multiply our ontology beyond necessity? As the philosopher William M. Keeney famously put it, to posit an infinity of concrete worlds seems a far greater ontological burden than to accept a modest set of abstract possibilities. The worry is that Lewis's theory inflates the inventory of entities without sufficient payoff, violating the principle of parsimony, often invoked as Occam's razor. Lewis anticipates this objection with a nuanced response. He argues that the cost of ontological extravagance must be weighed against the explanatory benefits that modal realism provides. In his own words, the best system account of the world's laws shows that the plurality of worlds is not a hypothesis but a fact. It is the simplest way to make sense of the modal structure of our language and thought. By best system, Lewis refers to the idea that the laws of nature are those generalizations that achieve the optimal balance of simplicity and strength across the totality of worlds. In this view, the existence of many worlds is not an unnecessary surplus. Rather, it is the very condition that allows the best system account to function. The plurality of worlds makes it possible to evaluate the simplicity and strength of laws globally, rather than being confined to a single world's perspective. This global evaluation, Lewis contends, yields a more parsimonious overall theory, even if it introduces a great number of entities. Moreover, Lewis reinterprets the principle of parsimony itself. He points out that Occam's razor is a methodological guideline, not a metaphysical axiom. It tells us to prefer theories that make fewer assumptions given a particular explanatory aim. If the aim is to provide a unified account of modality, counterfactuals, and the semantics of necessity, then a theory that reduces modal discourse to quantification over concrete worlds achieves a higher explanatory payoff than a theory that must treat possible worlds as mere abstractions, with ad hoc truth conditions attached to each modal operator. In other words, the extravagance is justified because it eliminates the need for a separate, mysterious realm of possible states of affairs that would otherwise have to be explained. The second major objection is the epistemic access challenge. If there are countless worlds, each causally isolated from our own, how can we ever know anything about them? How can we justify claims that there exists a world where Napoleon won at Waterloo, or a world where perpetual motion is possible, when we have no empirical contact with these realms? Critics argue that this renders modal realism unfalsifiable, and therefore, in the Popperian sense, unscientific. Lewis's reply is both pragmatic and philosophical. He acknowledges that we cannot have direct observational access to other worlds, but he argues that indirect, inferential access suffices. The key is that our modal statements are grounded in the logical and linguistic structures we employ. When we say it is possible that X, we are not asserting empirical knowledge about a distant world. We are expressing that the proposition X is consistent with the totality of what could be. The consistency check is a matter of logical coherence, not empirical verification. In this sense, our knowledge of other worlds is mediated through the coherence of our concepts and the logical relations among them. Lewis famously writes, "Our knowledge of other worlds is a matter of knowledge of the content of propositions, not of knowledge of the existence of particular concrete objects." The epistemic bridge is built from the internal logic of language and thought, rather than from sensory experience. Lewis also points to the success of modal logic itself as indirect evidence. The very fact that we can reason systematically about necessity and possibility, and that this reasoning yields reliable predictions about everyday counterfactuals, suggests that there is a robust underlying structure. Modal realism supplies that structure in a way that is both systematic and unambiguous. The theory's explanatory power, therefore, justifies belief in the existence of other worlds, even if we cannot observe them directly. To see how these responses play out in practice, let us turn to a pivotal historical moment, the 1975 debate between David Lewis and Alvin Plantinga at the University of Notre Dame. Plantinga, a leading proponent of actualism, argued that only the actual world and its parts truly exist, and that possible worlds are merely useful fictions. He challenged Lewis by asking, if there are countless concrete worlds, why do we never encounter them? Why should we grant them ontological status? Lewis, with characteristic calm, replied that the question presupposes a misunderstanding of the role of indexicals. He reminded Plantinga that the term actual is not a property but a point of reference, and that the existence of other worlds does not entail any causal interaction. The debate, recorded in the Proceedings of the American Philosophical Quarterly, became a touchstone for modal realism's defenders. Plantinga's critique sharpened Lewis's articulation of the epistemic access argument, and the exchange highlighted the subtlety with which Lewis navigated the tension between metaphysical commitment and epistemic humility. Another anecdote that captures Lewis's playful yet rigorous spirit comes from a 1982 colloquium at Cambridge, where he introduced the term pluriverse to describe the totality of all possible worlds. As the story goes, a graduate student in the audience whispered, "Is this a new kind of multiverse?" Lewis smiled and replied, "Indeed, but not the cosmological multiverse of inflationary theory. Rather a metaphysical pluriverse where each world is as concrete as the one we call here." The term pluriverse stuck, and it has since become a shorthand for Lewis's expansive ontology, echoing in contemporary discussions of both philosophy and physics. Speaking of physics, it is impossible to overlook the resonance between Lewis's modal realism and the modern multiverse hypotheses that arise in cosmology and quantum theory. In inflationary cosmology, the eternal inflation model predicts a vast landscape of bubble universes, each with potentially different physical constants. In the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, every quantum measurement spawns a branching of worlds, each representing a different outcome. While Lewis himself was careful not to equate his metaphysical worlds with these scientific proposals, the structural similarity invites fruitful cross-disciplinary dialogue. Both frameworks involve a plenitude of concrete realities, each governed by its own set of laws or initial conditions. Philosophers have noted, for instance, that the measure problem in cosmology, how to assign probabilities across an infinite ensemble of universes, mirrors the challenges Lewis faced in defining a probability distribution over possible worlds for decision-theoretic purposes. The conversation thus flows both ways. Insights from physics can inform the metaphysical grounding of modal realism, and Lewis's rigorous treatment of possible worlds can sharpen the conceptual tools physicists use when they speak of a multiverse. Crick's possible world semantics for modal logic, developed in the early 1960s, provides another crucial cross-reference. Saul Crick introduced a formal semantics in which the truth of a modal statement is evaluated relative to a set of possible worlds, and an accessibility relation that captures the notion of worlds that are relevantly similar. While Crick's approach treats worlds as abstract points in a model, Lewis took the next step, insisting that those points are concrete, spatiotemporal realms. The dialogue between Crick and Lewis illustrates a productive tension. Crick's semantics supplies the formal machinery, while Lewis supplies the ontological commitment that gives that machinery metaphysical weight. In later works, Lewis even acknowledges Crick's influence, noting that the semantics of modal logic is a powerful guide, but it does not decide the metaphysical question of whether worlds are mere abstractions or concrete entities. This interplay demonstrates how modal realism sits at the intersection of formal logic, metaphysics, and linguistic theory. Returning to the formal definition of a world, it is worth emphasizing how Lewis's notion of maximality dovetails with the idea of completeness in logical models. A world, for Lewis, contains a truth-value assignment for every proposition in the language under consideration. No proposition is left indeterminate. This completeness is essential for evaluating counterfactuals. To determine whether a counterfactual is true, we must be able to compare the actual world with the nearest possible worlds that satisfy the antecedent, and then see whether the consequent holds. The nearest worlds are identified via a similarity metric, a concept that Lewis refines in his later work on counterfactuals, drawing on Stalnaker's notion of closest worlds. The metric is not a fixed distance but a comparative ordering that respects certain constraints, preserving the laws of nature as much as possible, making minimal changes to particular facts, and so forth. In this way, the formal apparatus of modal realism becomes a sophisticated tool for analyzing everyday reasoning. Let us consider a concrete example of a counterfactual that illustrates the machinery. Suppose we say if the match had been struck, the fire would have started. To evaluate this, we locate worlds that are identical to ours up to the moment the match is struck, then diverge only in the relevant physical processes that follow. In worlds where the laws of chemistry hold as they do here, striking the match leads to combustion, so the consequent is true. In worlds where the match is struck but the chemical composition of the match is altered, perhaps it is made of a non-flammable material, the fire does not start. The truth of the original counterfactual depends on the ordering of these worlds. The worlds that preserve the relevant laws of chemistry are judged more similar than worlds that introduce radical physical changes. This ordering is made possible precisely because we have a plenitude of concrete worlds to draw upon. The similarity relation is a comparative assessment across real, fully formed possibilities. Beyond the realm of abstract analysis, modal realism also offers a lens through which we can view historical and scientific reasoning. Historians often engage in what-if speculation, asking how events might have unfolded under different circumstances. When a historian writes, "Had the United States not entered World War II, the balance of power in Europe would have shifted dramatically," they are, perhaps unwittingly, invoking a modal framework that resonates with Lewis's ontology. The historian is positing a world, one where the United States remains neutral, and then reasoning about the consequences in that world. If we accept Lewis's view, the historian's speculation is not merely a narrative device. It is a claim about an actual, concrete world that exists somewhere in the pluriverse. This perspective can sharpen our understanding of historical methodology, reminding us that counterfactuals are not frivolous, but are anchored in a metaphysical structure that gives them legitimacy. In the domain of legal reasoning, the use of counterfactuals is even more pronounced. Courts often ask, would the defendant have acted differently if a certain fact had been true? When we turn our attention to the way language stretches beyond what actually happened, we find ourselves standing at the crossroads of imagination and logic. The philosopher David Lewis, whose work on possible worlds reshaped contemporary metaphysics, offers a map for navigating that crossroads. He asks us to consider each if-then statement not as a vague, wishful thought, but as a claim that can be evaluated for truth by looking at the landscape of worlds that could have been. In this segment, we will walk through Lewis's seminal analysis of counterfactual conditionals, linger over the mechanics of his similarity metric, linger on the ordering of worlds, and pause at the famous St. Paul's Cathedral illustration. We will then move to two fresh examples, a counterfactual about the Boston Tea Party and a simple physics-style glass drop scenario, before confronting two of the most persistent objections: the alleged vagueness of similarity and the problem of impossible antecedents. We will see how Lewis refined his original proposal with the system of spheres and later with a causal chain approach, and we will hear a couple of anecdotes that reveal how these ideas were debated in the halls of Stanford and even in the private musings of Lewis himself. Finally, we will tie his theory back to David Hume's regularity view of causation and to the modern causal modeling work of Judea Pearl, showing how the possible world semantics of counterfactuals continue to echo through the corridors of philosophy and science. The story begins, as many philosophical stories do, with a simple question: what does it mean to say, if the cathedral had collapsed, the city would look different? At first glance, the sentence seems obvious. If something dramatic had happened, the surrounding facts would change. Yet philosophers have long recognized that the truth value of such a statement is not settled by the actual world alone. Lewis, in his 1973 book Counterfactuals, proposes that we evaluate the statement by looking at the nearest possible world in which the antecedent, the cathedral had collapsed, is true. In that nearest world, we then check whether the consequent, the city would look different, holds. If it does, the counterfactual is true. If not, it is false. The key idea is that among all the worlds where the antecedent is true, some are more like our actual world than others, and the closest or most similar world determines the truth value. Lewis does not leave the notion of closest to intuition alone. He introduces a similarity metric that compares worlds along several dimensions: the preservation of the laws of nature, the similarity of large-scale facts, the similarity of particular events, and the preservation of the spatio-temporal distribution of objects. In his own words, the worlds that are most like the actual world are those that preserve the greatest amount of its total content, especially its law-like regularities. Lewis, Counterfactuals, p. 22. Imagine a stack of transparent sheets, each representing a possible world, with the actual world at the top. As we move down the stack, each sheet diverges a little more from the one above it, perhaps a different weather pattern, perhaps a different political decision. The sheet that first shows the cathedral collapsed, while otherwise matching the actual world as closely as possible, is the one we consult. To make this picture more concrete, Lewis introduces an ordering of worlds. He speaks of a system of spheres surrounding the actual world. Each sphere contains worlds that are equally distant from the actual world in terms of similarity. The innermost sphere contains worlds that differ from the actual world only in the minimal way required to make the antecedent true. The next sphere out contains worlds that differ a bit more, and so on, expanding outward like ripples in a pond. The truth of a counterfactual is determined by the first sphere that contains at least one world where the antecedent holds. If in that sphere the consequent also holds, the counterfactual is true. This elegant construction allows us to formalize what had previously been an informal, intuition-driven practice. Lewis illustrates the method with the now classic St. Paul's Cathedral example. He asks us to imagine that, contrary to fact, the great cathedral in London had collapsed in the 17th century. He then asks whether the city would have looked different would be true. To answer, we search for the nearest possible world in which the cathedral fell. In that world, the laws of physics are the same. The Great Fire of London still occurs, but the cathedral's absence changes the skyline, the pattern of tourist routes, perhaps even the way certain religious ceremonies are performed. The consequent, the city would look different, is indeed true in that closest world, so the counterfactual is affirmed. Lewis writes, if St. Paul's Cathedral had collapsed, London would look different. Lewis, Counterfactuals, p. 33. The example shows how the semantics of if can be rendered precise without sacrificing the richness of our ordinary language. Let us now bring the theory into two fresh contexts, each of which illuminates a different facet of Lewis's account. First, consider a sweeping historical counterfactual. If the Boston Tea Party had never occurred, the American Revolution would have been delayed. The antecedent, no act of defiance in 1773, requires us to locate the nearest possible world where this particular event does not happen, while preserving as much of the actual world as possible. In that world, the British Parliament still imposes the tea tax, the colonies still experience growing resentment, but the symbolic spark that galvanized colonial unity is missing. The closest world would likely feature a different catalyst, perhaps the burning of the HMS Earl of Pembroke or a later protest, but the overall trajectory toward independence is preserved, albeit on a slower timetable. In the innermost sphere where the antecedent holds, the consequent, that the revolution would be delayed, remains true, because the absence of the Tea Party removes an immediate rallying point, thereby postponing the cascade of events that led to war. The counterfactual, then, is true according to Lewis's semantics. Second, let us turn to a more mundane, everyday scenario. If a glass were dropped, it would shatter. Here the antecedent is a straightforward physical event, and the consequent follows from the well-known laws of brittle fracture. To evaluate the statement, we look for the closest world where a glass is dropped. Since the laws of physics are preserved across the innermost sphere, the glass will still be made of the same material, will fall under the same gravitational acceleration, and will strike the floor with comparable force. In that world, the glass shatters, confirming the truth of the counterfactual. This example demonstrates that Lewis's framework can accommodate not only grand historical divergences, but also ordinary causal claims about everyday objects. Yet, as any philosopher knows, a robust theory invites criticism. Two of the most persistent challenges to Lewis's possible world semantics are the vagueness of similarity, critique, and the impossibility of impossible antecedents, challenge. The first objection asks, how can we measure how close a possible world is to the actual world? The similarity metric, critics argue, is underdetermined. Different philosophers might give different weights to laws versus particular facts, leading to divergent judgments about which world is truly closest. As philosopher James Woodward famously put it, the notion of a most similar possible world seems to beg the question of what similarity itself is. Woodward, Making Things Happen, 2003, p. 12. If the metric is vague, then the truth value of many counterfactuals becomes indeterminate, undermining the explanatory power of the theory. Lewis anticipated this concern and responded by emphasizing that the similarity ordering is not a precise numerical distance, but a partial order guided by a hierarchy of criteria. He argued that the preservation of law-like regularities outranks the preservation of accidental particulars. In the St. Paul's Cathedral case, the laws of physics and the historical facts about the Great Fire are preserved, while the cathedral's existence is allowed to vary. Moreover, Lewis suggested that the similarity ordering is context-sensitive. The relevant aspects of similarity depend on the content of the antecedent and the interests of the speaker. While this response softens the charge of absolute vagueness, critics maintain that it leaves the theory vulnerable to subjective judgments. The second objection, often called the impossible antecedents problem, challenges the ability of Lewis's framework to handle counterfactuals whose antecedents are logically contradictory. Consider the statement, if squares were circles, geometry would be impossible. The antecedent is impossible in any possible world, because a square cannot be a circle by definition. Since Lewis's semantics rely on finding a possible world where the antecedent holds, the counterfactual seems to lack a truth value. Yet ordinary language does allow us to make sense of such statements, often as a way of highlighting logical impossibility or exploring the consequences of redefining concepts. Lewis's early work sidestepped the issue by restricting attention to non-vacuously false antecedents, those that could be true in some possible world. Later, however, he introduced a refinement known as the system of spheres that can be extended to accommodate impossible antecedents by treating them as vacuously true in every world that fails to satisfy the antecedent. In this approach, the counterfactual's truth hinges on whether the consequent holds in all worlds where the antecedent is true. Since there are none, the conditional is vacuously true. This move, while technically consistent, feels counterintuitive to many who would rather say that the statement is simply meaningless. The debate over impossible antecedents continues to animate contemporary discussions of counterfactual logic. Lewis did not remain static in the face of these critiques. In the later chapters of Counterfactuals and in subsequent papers, he introduced a more nuanced picture. The system of spheres is complemented by a causal chain approach. Here, the truth of a counterfactual is tied not merely to similarity, but to the existence of a causal pathway linking the antecedent to the consequent in the nearest world where the antecedent holds. In other words, we look for a world where the antecedent is true, and where there is an unbroken chain of causal events leading from the antecedent to the consequent, without any intervening, miraculous violations of the laws of nature. This causal chain condition helps to rule out worlds that are superficially similar, but where the consequent occurs for unrelated reasons. To illustrate, return to the glass drop example. The causal chain runs from the act of dropping, through the acceleration due to gravity, to the impact with the floor, and finally to the fracture of the glass. In the nearest world where the glass is dropped, this chain is intact, so the consequent follows. In a world where the glass is dropped, but say, an invisible force field prevents it from hitting the floor, the causal chain is broken, and the consequent would not hold. The causal chain refinement thus sharpens the semantics, ensuring that the truth of the counterfactual depends on the natural flow of events rather than on arbitrary coincidences. The evolution of Lewis's theory cannot be fully appreciated without situating it in the broader historical context of the philosophy of causation. David Hume, writing in the 18th century, famously reduced causation to regularities. We have no notion of a necessary connection. We only observe that certain types of events constantly follow others. Hume, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, 1748, Section 4. Hume's regularity theory leaves the door open for a counterfactual reading. If event A had not occurred, event B would not have followed, yet Hume stops short of formalizing the semantics. Lewis, building on Hume, provides the machinery that makes such counterfactual reasoning precise, embedding regularities within a possible world framework and then enriching the picture with causal chains. In doing so, he bridges the gap between the empirical observation of regularities and the logical structure of conditional statements. Fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and we encounter Judea Pearl's causal modeling paradigm. Pearl's structural equation models, causal diagrams, and do calculus formalize how interventions affect outcomes, echoing Lewis's counterfactual semantics. Pearl himself acknowledges the influence of possible world semantics, noting that the do operator can be understood as moving to a counterfactual world where we intervene to set a variable to a particular value. Pearl, Causality, 2009, p. 45. While Pearl's approach is more mathematically oriented, the underlying intuition that we evaluate the consequences of a hypothetical intervention by considering a modified world is directly traceable to Lewis's possible world analysis. This cross-disciplinary resonance illustrates how Lewis's ideas have permeated not only philosophy, but also computer science, statistics, and artificial intelligence. The impact of Lewis's theory was not limited to scholarly journals. It sparked lively debate in academic gatherings. One memorable episode took place in 1978 at a symposium on conditionals held at Stanford University. The conference brought together David Lewis, Robert Stalnaker, and a host of younger philosophers eager to test the limits of the possible world semantics. Stalnaker, who had developed his own possible world account centered on a selection function that picks a single closest world rather than an ordered sphere, challenged Lewis on the issue of multiple equally close worlds. He argued that the semantics should be deterministic. For any antecedent there is a unique best world. Stalnaker, 1978 conference address. Lewis, ever the advocate of pluralism, responded that the sphere structure naturally accommodates ties, allowing for a set of worlds that are equally close, and that the truth of a counterfactual is secured if the consequent holds in all of them. The debate was spirited, with participants volleying examples ranging from the collapse of the Berlin Wall to the hypothetical invention of time travel. The proceedings, later published in Philosophical Review, captured a moment when the field was crystallizing around a shared vocabulary, even as scholars continued to diverge on technical details. The Lewis-Stalnaker rivalry, as it came to be called, propelled further refinements on both sides and cemented the centrality of possible world semantics in the study of conditionals. Beyond the conference hall, Lewis himself had a personal habit that brought the theory into his everyday life. Friends and colleagues recalled that he would often sit in his modest office at Princeton, a cup of tea cooling beside his notebook, and mentally run through counterfactual scenarios about his own choices. He would ask, if I had taken the job at Harvard instead of Princeton, would my research on modal realism have taken a different direction? He would then imagine the nearest possible world where he accepted the Harvard offer, preserving as much of his intellectual trajectory as possible, and assess whether the core ideas he later developed would still have emerged. In his own words, recorded in a letter to a former student, he wrote, "I find it useful to test the robustness of my theories by imagining that I had made a different career move. If the conclusions survive in the closest worlds, I am more confident in their necessity." Lewis, Personal Correspondence, 1982. This anecdote reveals that Lewis did not treat possible worlds as an abstract laboratory detached from lived experience. He used the very tool he advocated to examine his own life, illustrating the intimate connection between philosophical method and personal reflection. Let us now return to the mechanics of the similarity ordering, because it is here that the theory's subtlety shines. Lewis proposes a hierarchy of criteria. First, the preservation of the laws of nature. Second, the preservation of the spatio-temporal arrangement of large-scale objects. Third, the preservation of the particular facts that are not directly implicated by the antecedent. This hierarchy can be visualized as a series of concentric shells. The innermost shell respects the laws of physics, gravity still works, chemical reactions still follow the same pathways. The next shell respects the big picture of the world, cities retain their locations, oceans retain their boundaries. The outer shells allow for increasingly radical changes, such as different cultural practices or alternate histories. When we evaluate a counterfactual, we first check whether there is a world in the innermost shell where the antecedent holds. If not, we expand to the next shell, and so on, until we find a sphere that contains at least one world satisfying the antecedent. The truth of the consequent is then assessed in all worlds within that sphere. This systematic approach prevents us from arbitrarily cherry-picking a world that makes the consequent true. Instead, we are forced to respect the similarity ordering. Consider again the Boston Tea Party counterfactual. The antecedent "no Tea Party" violates a specific historical event, but it does not disturb the underlying laws of physics or the broad geopolitical landscape of the 18th century. Therefore, the nearest worlds where the Tea Party does not happen lie in the second sphere, preserving laws and the large-scale colonial structure while varying only the particular event. Within that sphere, we examine whether the consequent delayed revolution holds across all worlds. In most of those worlds, the colonists still experience taxation without representation, but the rallying cry that the Tea Party provided is absent, leading to a slower mobilization. The counterfactual is thus true in Lewis's sense. Now, let us examine the glass drop example through the same lens. The antecedent, dropping a glass, requires only a minimal deviation from the actual world. The hand moves, the glass leaves the table. The laws of physics are untouched, and the macroscopic arrangement of objects remains the same. Consequently, the nearest imagine a bustling intersection in the heart of a city, cars streaming in every direction, pedestrians stepping onto the crosswalk, cyclists weaving through the flow. No traffic light glows above, no police officer waves a baton. Yet the scene unfolds without chaos because each participant knows, almost without thinking, which side of the road to keep to, when to yield, when to proceed. That silent agreement, that shared pattern of behavior, is what David Lewis calls a convention. It is not a law handed down from a distant authority, nor a mere habit formed by accident. It is, in Lewis's careful analysis, a solution to a coordination problem, a way for individuals, each pursuing their own interests, to align their actions in a mutually beneficial pattern. In his seminal work Convention, a philosophical study, Lewis sets out to show how such regularities arise, how they become stable, and why we regard them as more than just habits. He proposes a three-stage model that captures the essence of any convention. The first stage is a regularity of behavior. People repeatedly act in a certain way in a particular situation. The second stage is a mutual expectation. Each person expects that the others will act in the same way. The third stage is a shared belief that this regularity is a convention. That is, that it exists because it solves a coordination problem and that it is sustained by the collective recognition of its role. Let us unpack each of these stages, step by step, and see how they interlock to form the fabric of social life. Then we will examine two vivid examples, traffic conventions and the linguistic politeness marker, please, to see the theory in action. After that, we will turn to two powerful objections that have been raised against Lewis's account, and we will follow Lewis's own game-theoretic response, which brings equilibrium concepts to bear on the heart of the matter. Along the way, I will share two anecdotes from the history of philosophy that bring these ideas to life. The 1980 Cambridge Conference, where Lewis sparred with John Searle over speech acts, and the quirky habit that Lewis himself cultivated, leaving the lights on in his office as a personal convention. Finally, we will look beyond Lewis, drawing connections to Thomas Schelling's notion of focal points and to contemporary research on social norms in behavioral economics. By the end of this segment, you should feel not only that conventions are rational solutions to coordination problems, but also that they are woven into the very way we think, speak, and move through the world. The first stage, regularity of behavior, may sound almost trivial. After all, humans are creatures of habit. We repeat actions because they are efficient, because they are taught, because they are comfortable. Yet Lewis insists that for a regularity to be a candidate for a convention, it must be observable across a community, not just within an individual's private routine. Think of the traffic example again. In the United Kingdom, the regularity is that cars keep to the left side of the road. In the United States, the regularity is that cars keep to the right. These are not idiosyncrasies of a single driver. They are patterns that persist across millions of drivers, across generations, across cities and rural highways alike. The regularity is robust enough that even a foreign visitor, unfamiliar with the local customs, can quickly learn to follow it by observation. The second stage, mutual expectation, adds a crucial layer of social cognition. It is not enough that a regularity exists. Each participant must expect that others will conform to it. This expectation is what transforms a mere habit into a coordinated practice. If a driver in the United Kingdom were to expect that most other drivers would keep to the right, then the regularity of left-hand traffic would collapse into chaos. The driver's expectation must align with the observed regularity. In game-theoretic terms, we are looking at a situation where each player's best response depends on the belief that the other players will choose a particular strategy. The regularity becomes self-reinforcing because each person's expectation validates the regularity, and the regularity in turn validates the expectation. The third stage, shared belief that the regularity is a convention, captures the metacognitive element that Lewis believes distinguishes a true convention from a simple habit. Here, the community not only acts in a coordinated way, but also recognizes that the coordination is intentional, that it solves a problem, and that it persists because of this recognition. Lewis writes, a convention is a regularity of behavior which is the solution to a coordination problem and which is recognized as such by the participants. This quote from the opening pages of Convention is the linchpin of his argument. The shared belief is what gives the regularity its normative force. We do not merely keep to the left because we have been taught to do so. We do so because we understand that doing otherwise would jeopardize the smooth flow of traffic, and because we collectively endorse the rule as the best solution to that problem. Now let us see how this three-stage model operates in a concrete linguistic setting, the use of the word please as a marker of politeness. In many English-speaking cultures, please is inserted before a request to signal deference and to mitigate the imposition. The regularity of behavior is that speakers typically say, "Could you pass the salt, please?" rather than simply, "Pass the salt." This regularity is observed across a wide range of contexts, restaurants, offices, homes. The second stage, mutual expectation, means that when you hear a request, you expect the speaker to have prefixed it with please. If the request comes without that marker, you might interpret it as brusque or even rude. The expectation is so ingrained that a simple omission can trigger a feeling of social discomfort. The third stage, the shared belief that this regularity is a convention, is perhaps the most subtle. Speakers do not merely use please because they have been conditioned to do so. They also understand that the word functions as a social contract. By saying please, you are acknowledging the listener's autonomy and inviting cooperation. The listener in turn recognizes that the request is framed as a courtesy and therefore feels a normative pressure to comply. This shared belief is reinforced by cultural narratives. Children are taught that saying please is good manners, and adults remind each other that please is a sign of respect. The convention of politeness thus satisfies Lewis's three-stage definition. It is a regular, mutually expected pattern of behavior that participants regard as a solution to the coordination problem of making requests without imposing undue burden. These two examples, traffic flow and linguistic politeness, illustrate how conventions permeate both the physical and the symbolic realms of human life. Yet Lewis's theory has faced formidable objections. The first is what philosophers and anthropologists call the cultural relativism objection. Critics ask, Do conventions truly arise from rational coordination, or are they merely the product of historical accident, power dynamics, and cultural inertia? In other words, if a community adopts a convention not because it solves a coordination problem, but because a dominant group imposed it, can we still call it a convention in Lewis's sense? Consider a society where a minority language is suppressed by a ruling class, and the majority language becomes the de facto mode of communication. The regularity of using the majority language is undeniable, and mutual expectations may align, but the shared belief that the regularity is a rational solution to a coordination problem is questionable. The convention may be sustained by coercion rather than by a genuine recognition of its problem-solving role. A second objection, the infinite regress critique, asks, how do we know that the convention is mutually recognized? If recognizing a convention requires believing that others recognize it, doesn't this lead to an endless chain of higher-order beliefs? In formal terms, the objection points out that Lewis's third stage, shared belief that the regularity is a convention, seems to require a common knowledge condition. Everyone must know that everyone else knows, and so on, ad infinitum. Critics argue that such common knowledge is impossible to achieve in practice, especially in large, heterogeneous societies. If the condition cannot be satisfied, then the model collapses. David Lewis, ever the analytic philosopher, responded to these challenges by turning to game theory, the mathematics of strategic interaction. He argued that the notion of common knowledge, while idealized, can be approximated by equilibrium concepts that capture the stability of conventions. In particular, Lewis appealed to the concept of a Nash equilibrium, a set of strategies where no player can unilaterally improve their payoff by deviating. In the traffic example, the equilibrium is the pattern where every driver keeps to the left or right. If any single driver were to switch sides, they would incur a high cost. The risk of collision, the confusion of other drivers, and the loss of smooth traffic flow. Therefore, the equilibrium is stable and the regularity persists, but Lewis went further. He introduced the idea of a focal point, borrowing from Thomas Schelling's work on coordination games. Schelling observed that in many coordination problems, even without communication, participants tend to converge on a solution that stands out as natural or salient. In the classic example of two people trying to meet in New York City without specifying a location, many will choose Grand Central Station because it is a well-known landmark, a focal point. Lewis saw the same mechanism at work in conventions. The regularity itself can become a focal point because it is the most obvious solution to the coordination problem. The mutual expectation that others will follow the focal point reinforces the equilibrium, and the shared belief that the regularity is a convention follows as a higher-order acknowledgement of the focal point's role. Lewis's reply to the cultural relativism objection is that even if a convention originates from power or accident, it can become a rational solution to a coordination problem over time. Once a regularity is in place, participants may come to recognize its utility, even if the original motivation was coercive. The convention, in Lewis's view, is a dynamic entity that can be reinterpreted and rejustified as the social context evolves. He writes, even conventions that have a historical pedigree in domination can, in the course of their life, acquire the status of a solution to a coordination problem and thereby be treated as conventions in the technical sense. In this sense, the theory is flexible enough to accommodate historical contingencies while preserving its analytic core. To the infinite regress critique, Lewis offered a more technical answer. He noted that game theory provides a way to model common knowledge without requiring an actual infinite chain of beliefs. Instead, one can define a fixed point of belief states, a situation where each player's belief about the other's strategies is consistent with the actual strategies being played. This fixed point is what game theorists call a self-confirming equilibrium. In a self-confirming equilibrium, each player's beliefs are correct about the strategies that actually occur, even if they may be mistaken about off-the-equilibrium possibilities. Lewis argued that this weaker notion of common knowledge is sufficient for conventions to arise and persist. The participants do not need to know that everyone knows ad infinitum. They need only have a stable belief that the regularity is being followed, which is reinforced by observation and feedback. Let us pause for a moment and imagine a scenario that brings these abstract ideas into vivid relief. Picture a small town in the early 20th century, where the local post office decides to adopt a new schedule for mail delivery, 3 days a week instead of daily. The regularity mail arrives on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday quickly becomes observable. Residents, expecting the mail on those days, plan their bill payments, their correspondence, and even their social visits accordingly. Over time, the town's inhabitants develop a shared belief that this schedule is not merely a logistical decision by the post office, but a convention that solves the coordination problem of allocating limited postal resources while meeting the community's needs. Even if the original decision was made by a single bureaucrat, the community's acceptance and reinforcement of the schedule transform it into a convention in Lewis's sense. This anecdote shows how conventions can emerge, stabilize, and acquire normative force through the interplay of regularity, expectation, and shared belief. Now, let us turn to the first historical anecdote that illuminates Lewis's intellectual environment. In the spring of 1980, the University of Cambridge hosted a conference on the philosophy of language, bringing together leading figures such as John Searle, whose work on speech acts had reshaped the field, and David Lewis, whose analytic rigor was already making waves in metaphysics and decision theory. The conference's central session was a spirited debate titled Speech Acts and Conventions. Are they distinct? Searle argued that speech acts, utterances that perform actions like promising or commanding, are fundamentally performative and cannot be reduced to mere conventions. He famously claimed, "When I say I promise, I am not merely following a linguistic habit, I am bringing about a new normative status." Lewis, ever the formalist, responded by pointing out that the very success of speech acts depends on a background of conventions. The shared expectations about how words function, the regularity of certain linguistic patterns, and the communal belief that these patterns solve coordination problems in communication. He quoted his own earlier work saying, "Even the act of promising presupposes a convention about the reliability of promises and the expectations that speakers and hearers have about them." The debate was lively, with Searle emphasizing the irreducibility of intentionality, while Lewis highlighted the explanatory power of his three-stage model. Although the two philosophers never fully reconciled their positions, the exchange sharpened Lewis's articulation of conventions as the scaffolding upon which more complex linguistic phenomena are built. It also underscored the relevance of conventions beyond simple traffic rules or polite markers, extending them into the realm of intentional speech. The second anecdote is more personal, but no less illuminating. David Lewis was known among his colleagues for a peculiar habit. He always left the lights on in his office, even when he was the only one present. When asked why, he replied with a wry smile, "It is my own little convention. If I turn the lights off, I might forget to turn them back on, and the dark would be a nuisance for the next visitor." Over time, his graduate assistants and visiting scholars noticed the pattern and began to expect that the office would be illuminated at any hour. The regularity of the lights being on became a mutual expectation, and eventually, a shared belief emerged that the illuminated office was part of the Lewis experience. A subtle, informal convention that facilitated a welcoming academic environment. This personal quirk illustrates how conventions can arise in micro-contexts, guided by the same three-stage dynamics that operate on a societal scale. It also shows that conventions need not be codified in law or formal policy. They can be cultivated through consistent practice and shared recognition. Returning to the theoretical core, let us examine more closely the game-theoretic machinery that Lewis employs. In a coordination game, each player has a set of strategies, and the payoffs are higher when players choose matching strategies. The classic example is the battle of the sexes, where a couple must decide whether to go to a football game or a ballet. Both prefer to be together, but each has a different preferred venue. The game has two pure strategy Nash equilibria: both go to the football game or both go to the ballet. Which equilibrium is selected depends on focal points, cultural cues, historical precedents, or salient features that make one outcome stand out. Lewis argued that conventions function as focal points that break the symmetry of coordination games. In the traffic scenario, the side of the road serves as the focal point. In the please example, the word itself serves as a linguistic focal point that signals politeness. Schelling's notion of focal points, introduced in his 1960 book The Strategy of Conflict, resonates deeply with Lewis's view. Schelling wrote, "In the absence of communication, participants will try to select the equilibrium that is most salient to them." Lewis took this insight and embedded it within his three-stage model. The regularity of behavior becomes salient, the mutual expectation follows, and the shared belief that the regularity solves a coordination problem crystallizes the focal point into a convention. This cross-fertilization between philosophy and game theory exemplifies the interdisciplinary richness of Lewis's project. Modern research in behavioral economics has taken these ideas even further. Scholars such as Ernst Feyer and Simon Gechter have conducted experiments on social norms, behaviors that persist because they are believed to be expected by others, even when they involve costly altruism. In a classic public goods game, participants contribute to a common pool, even when the dominant strategy, from a narrow self-interest perspective, would be to free ride. The researchers found that contributions increase dramatically when participants are told that contributions are the norm in the group. This empirical finding mirrors Lewis's third stage. The shared belief that a regularity contributing is a convention, the norm, leads to higher rates of coordination on the cooperative outcome. Similarly, Ellickson's ethnographic study of informal institutions among cattle ranchers in the American West shows how conventions, such as the practice of grazing rights, emerge without formal legal enforcement, sustained by mutual expectations and shared beliefs about the benefits of coordination. Another contemporary line of inquiry comes from the field of computational social science, where researchers model the diffusion of conventions across networks. Using agent-based simulations, scholars have demonstrated that when agents adopt a behavior based on both local regularities and a belief in the behavior's coordination value, the system quickly converges to a stable convention, even in the presence of noise and heterogeneity. These findings provide a modern quantitative complement to Lewis's analytic framework, showing that the three-stage model can imagine, for a moment, a universe not as a single, solitary tapestry, but as a vast, shimmering multiverse of countless, fully fleshed-out worlds, each as concrete and real as the one we inhabit. That is the bold vision that David Lewis offered us, a vision that has reverberated through philosophy, economics, physics, and even the way we think about everyday choice. In the years since the publication of On the Plurality of Worlds, the contours of Lewis's legacy have taken on a richness that could not have been anticipated by the modest, almost shy mathematician-philosopher who first set out to defend modal realism. As we trace the impact of his ideas, we encounter a tapestry of praise and criticism, of new applications that stretch his framework into decision theory and the metaphysics of grounding, and of a community of thinkers who have taken his systematic calmness as a model for their own imaginative inquiries. The first ripple of Lewis's influence can be seen in the way philosophers now speak almost instinctively about possible worlds. When we say that a proposition is necessarily true, we no longer merely invoke an abstract logical schema. We picture a whole landscape of worlds where that proposition holds, and we compare it to worlds where it does not. This shift, subtle as it may seem, has transformed the very grammar of metaphysics. It is no accident that contemporary debates about essentialism, counterfactuals, and even the nature of time often begin with a nod to Lewis's world semantics. The elegance of his approach lies in its simplicity. Treat possible worlds as concrete entities and let the machinery of set theory do the heavy lifting. In doing so, Lewis turned a philosophical puzzle into a problem that could be tackled with the precision of mathematics, while never losing sight of the vivid, almost poetic imagination that underlies the notion of other worlds. Yet, as with any grand vision, Lewis's modal realism has attracted its share of rigorous scrutiny. One of the most sustained challenges comes from the modal anti-realist camp, most prominently represented by Kit Fine. Fine, in his series of papers on the metaphysics of modality, argues that the existence of an infinite multitude of concrete worlds is metaphysically extravagant, and that we can achieve the same explanatory power by treating possible worlds as abstract representations, what he calls modal ersatzicism. Fine's objection is not merely a matter of ontological thrift. He contends that the realist picture threatens the very coherence of modality. If every way a proposition could be true is already realized somewhere, then the notion of possibility loses its normative bite. Fine famously writes, "To say that something is possible is to say that there is a world in which it is true, but if worlds are merely linguistic or propositional constructs, that claim collapses into a triviality." In this view, the richness of modal discourse is preserved without committing to a literal multiverse. Robert Stalnaker offers a parallel, though distinct, critique that has become known as modal ersatzicism. Stalnaker's approach treats possible worlds not as concrete islands, but as maximal consistent sets of propositions, essentially as ways the actual world could have been. He emphasizes the role of accessibility relations and the semantics of counterfactuals, arguing that the machinery of possible world semantics can be retained without inflating our ontology. In his own words, the worlds of my semantics are not worlds at all, but merely descriptions of ways the actual world might have been. Stalnaker's Ersatz stance preserves the utility of Lewis's formal tools while sidestepping the metaphysical cost of an infinite realm of concrete worlds. The tension between these two anti-realist positions and Lewis's bold realism has become a central dialectic in contemporary modal metaphysics, a dialectic that continues to sharpen our understanding of what it means to speak about possibility. Beyond the technical disputes, there is a more existential critique that has lingered in the background, the claim that modal realism undermines moral responsibility. The ethical objection suggests that if every possible choice we could make is realized in some world, then our actual decisions lose their weight. If for every action we take, there exists a world where we take the opposite action, what does it mean to hold anyone accountable? This line of thought has been explored by philosophers such as Peter van Inwagen and Susan Hurley, who worry that Lewis's framework makes moral evaluation a matter of mere description rather than prescription. As Hurley puts it, when all possibilities are actualized, the moral significance of any single act seems to evaporate into a statistical cloud. The objection forces us to confront whether a metaphysical picture can coexist with our deeply held intuitions about agency, blame, and praise. Lewis himself anticipated some of these concerns, though perhaps not in the precise language of contemporary moral philosophy. In a footnote to On the Plurality of Worlds, he remarked, "The fact that there are worlds in which I do not act as I do here does not diminish the fact that I act as I do here." His response was to separate the ontological claim that worlds exist from the epistemic and normative claims about our actions. Yet the ethical objection remains a potent reminder that metaphysical commitments reverberate far beyond abstract theory, touching the very fabric of how we understand ourselves as agents. Even as these critiques sharpened, philosophers began to discover new arenas where Lewis's possible world semantics could be fruitfully applied. One striking example lies in decision theory, particularly in the infamous Newcomb's problem. In this thought experiment, an agent faces two boxes, one transparent containing $1,000 and one opaque, which either contains $1 million or nothing. A predictor who has been infallibly accurate in the past has already placed the $1 million in the opaque box if and only if it predicts the agent will take only that box. The rational choice seems paradoxical. The expected utility calculation suggests taking both boxes, yet the predictor's reliability makes the one-box choice appear dominant. Lewis's possible world framework offers a way to model the predictor's knowledge as a set of worlds where the agent's decision and the predictor's prediction cohere. By treating the predictor's epistemic state as a function over possible worlds, one can formalize the notion that the agent's choice is correlated across worlds, thereby resolving the tension between causal decision theory and evidential decision theory. The elegance of this solution lies in its ability to retain Lewis's concrete worlds, while providing a clear account of how information about other worlds can influence actual decision-making. A second, more recent application emerges in the metaphysics of grounding, an area that has seen a pluralist turn in the past decade. Grounding concerns the way in which some facts depend on, or are determined by, more fundamental facts. Philosophers such as Kit Fine-Again, as well as Robert Koons and Peter van Inwagen, have employed Lewisian machinery to articulate a hierarchy of worlds in which grounding relations are instantiated. In this view, a grounding fact in our world corresponds to a pattern that holds across a cluster of worlds, each reflecting a different level of metaphysical depth. The pluralist turn, championed by scholars like Paul Horwich and Michael Rea, argues that there is no single monolithic grounding relation but a family of such relations, each appropriate to a different domain: physics, mathematics, ethics. Lewis's framework provides the scaffolding for this plurality. By mapping each domain onto a distinct set of possible worlds, we can see how grounding relations vary without collapsing into a universal, one-size-fits-all notion. This approach has breathed new life into debates about the nature of explanation, the structure of reality, and the limits of reductionism. The influence of Lewis's ideas has also seeped into the philosophy of physics, particularly through the Everett, or many worlds, interpretation of quantum mechanics. While Everett's original formulation was motivated by the formalism of the wave function, contemporary philosophers such as David Wallace and Simon Saunders have drawn explicit parallels between the branching structure of quantum worlds and Lewis's concrete possible worlds. In their view, the multiplicity of quantum branches can be understood as a physical realization of Lewisian modal realism, where each branch is a world in which a particular measurement outcome is actualized. This convergence has sparked a resurgence of interest in modal realism, now not merely as a metaphysical curiosity, but as a potential bridge between philosophy and cutting-edge physics. the dialogue is reciprocal. Physicists gain a clear conceptual vocabulary for talking about branching universes, while philosophers acquire a concrete metaphysical framework that can accommodate the strangeness of quantum superposition. To appreciate how Lewis's legacy has been cultivated and commemorated, we must turn to two historical anecdotes that illuminate the community's affection for his work. The first concerns the 1995 memorial volume titled The Many Worlds of David Lewis. Edited by a cadre of his most devoted students and colleagues, this collection brought together essays that both celebrated and critically examined Lewis's contributions. The volume was more than a tribute. It served as a catalyst for a new generation of scholars to engage with modal realism, grounding, and counterfactuals. In the introductory essay, philosopher Robert Stalnaker wrote, "Lewis gave us a map of a territory we never knew we possessed, and now we are all explorers, sometimes lost, sometimes triumphant, but always guided by his steady hand." The volume's impact was immediate, spawning conferences, special journal issues, and a surge of doctoral dissertations that took Lewis's ideas as their starting point. The second anecdote is more serendipitous, yet no less significant. After Lewis's death in 2001, a graduate student named Emily Hart, while cataloging his papers at Princeton, stumbled upon a set of unpublished notes labeled simply Modal Pluralism. These pages, written in Lewis's unmistakably meticulous hand, outlined a tentative project to reconcile his robust realism with a more nuanced pluralist view of modality, suggesting that some worlds might be more concrete than others, and that the hierarchy of worlds could be used to explain the apparent differences between logical, metaphysical, and epistemic possibility. The discovery sparked a flurry of scholarly activity. Within months, articles appeared in Philosophical Review and Mind that took these fragments as a springboard for new theories of modal ontologies. The modal pluralism notes have since been published in a special issue of Synthes, and they continue to inspire debates about whether Lewis's realism can be softened without losing its explanatory power. The episode illustrates how even after a philosopher's passing, their unfinished thoughts can ignite fresh dialogues, reinforcing the living nature of philosophical inquiry. Cross-referencing to contemporary thinkers, we find Timothy Williamson, whose work on modal epistemology offers both a tribute and a challenge to Lewis. Williamson argues that our knowledge of modality is grounded in a kind of knowledge of possibilities that is not best captured by concrete worlds, but by a more sophisticated epistemic structure. Yet he acknowledges a debt to Lewis's systematic approach, noting that the clarity of Lewis's possible world semantics provides the benchmark against which any alternative epistemology must be measured. In a recent lecture, Williamson remarked, "Lewis taught us that a good philosophical theory must be both rigorously formal and richly imaginative." My own project seeks to preserve that balance while rethinking the epistemic underpinnings. This dialogue exemplifies how Lewis's legacy is not a static monument but a dynamic conversation, where each new contribution is measured against his standard of disciplined creativity. Another contemporary voice that reverberates with Lewis's influence is the philosopher of physics, David Wallace. Wallace's defense of the Everett interpretation leans heavily on Lewisian language, describing quantum branches as worlds that are as real as the world we call the actual world. He writes, "If we accept that the wave function describes a multiverse of branching realities, then we are, in a sense, adopting a version of Lewis's modal realism. Only now the worlds are grounded in the mathematics of quantum theory rather than in set theoretic constructions." This bridging of metaphysics and physics demonstrates that Lewis's ideas have transcended disciplinary boundaries, providing a conceptual scaffolding that can be adapted to the most advanced scientific theories. Returning to the ethical objection, it is worth noting that some philosophers have turned the critique into a productive line of inquiry. For instance, the ethicist Derek Parfit, in his later work on personal identity, invoked Lewisian worlds to argue that concerns about responsibility can be reframed in terms of psychological continuity across worlds. Parfit suggests that the moral weight of an action is not diminished by the existence of alternate worlds. Rather, it is the pattern of our concerns that persists across the multiverse. By reinterpreting moral responsibility as a property of a network of worlds, Parfit offers a nuanced response that both respects Lewis's ontology and preserves the normative force of ethics. The debate over modal realism also intersects with contemporary discussions about the nature of truth. The correspondence theory, famously championed by philosophers like Bertrand Russell, finds a natural ally in Lewis's world semantics. A proposition is true if and only if it corresponds to a fact in the actual world and false otherwise. Yet Lewis's pluralism expands this picture, A proposition can be true in some worlds and false in others, allowing for a richer taxonomy of truth values. This insight has been taken up by contemporary truth theorists such as Michael Dummett and Hartree Field, who explore the implications of a world-relativized truth for the philosophy of language and logic. In the realm of decision theory, beyond Newcomb's problem, Lewisian possible worlds have been employed to model game-theoretic scenarios involving common knowledge and coordination. The classic Battle of the Sexes game, for example, can be analyzed by mapping each player's strategy onto a set of worlds where the other player's choice is fixed. By doing so, one can formalize the notion of shared expectations across worlds, offering a clearer account of how coordination can be achieved without communication. This application underscores the versatility of Lewis's framework. It is not confined to abstract metaphysics but can illuminate the structure of strategic interaction, where the interplay of possibilities and expectations is paramount. Analogies also help us grasp the subtlety of Lewis's ideas. One useful image is that of a library. Imagine the actual world as a particular book on a shelf, its pages filled with the events we experience. Lewis's possible worlds are the other books in the library, each with its own narrative, its own characters, its own plot twists. The library is concrete, the books are real objects, not mere summaries. When we consider a counterfactual, say, if it had rained yesterday, the streets would be wet, we are essentially opening a different book, reading the passage where rain occurs and noting the consequent wet streets. This library metaphor captures the concreteness of Lewis's worlds while preserving the intuitive sense that we can turn the page to explore alternatives. A second analogy, drawn from the world of music, compares possible worlds to distinct musical compositions. The actual world is a symphony we are currently hearing, with its particular melody, harmony, and rhythm. The other worlds are alternative symphonies composed in the same key, but with different thematic developments. When we ask whether a certain chord progression is possible, we are in effect asking whether there exists a composition in the library of symphonies that contains that progression. This musical picture highlights the creative richness of modal realism. Each world is a fully realized work of art, not a mere sketch, and the space of possible worlds is as vast as the space of all possible musical scores. The richness of Lewis's legacy is perhaps most evident in the way his work has been reinterpreted across divergent philosophical traditions. In the analytic tradition, scholars such as John Burgess and Peter van Inwagen have built elaborate systems of metaphysical analysis that take Lewis's worlds as primitive. In the continental tradition, thinkers like Graham Harman, though not directly invoking Lewis, share a commitment to a reality that is manifold and independent of human cognition, resonating with the same spirit of ontological generosity. Even within the philosophy of mind, the notion of multiple realizability, the idea that a mental state can be instantiated in many different physical substrates, finds a natural home in a Lewisian multiverse, where each realization corresponds to a distinct world hosting the same functional pattern. The ongoing dialogue between Lewis's realism and anti-realist positions continues to sharpen the tools of philosophical analysis. Kit Fine's modal anti-realism pushes us to question whether we truly need concrete worlds or whether a more parsimonious ersatist model suffices. Robert Stalnaker's ersathism, in turn, reminds us that the utility of possible world semantics does not automatically entail an ontological commitment. The ethical objection forces us to consider the normative dimensions of metaphysical theories, ensuring that our speculative constructions do not float free of human concerns. Each of these critiques, far from diminishing Lewis's impact, has served to deepen the conversation, prompting refinements, extensions, and at times, outright reconstructions of his ideas. One might wonder whether the sheer scale of Lewis's multiverse, an infinity of worlds, each as large as the observable universe, poses a problem of intelligibility. After all, how can a human mind, limited by its own finitude, ever hope to grasp such an immense structure? Lewis anticipated this worry, offering a pragmatic response. We do not need to enumerate worlds. We need only to understand the logical relations among them. In his own words, the point of possible world semantics is not to provide a catalog of worlds, but to give a framework in which we can talk about the way things could have been. This modest, almost humble, stance is part of what makes his approach both powerful and approachable. It invites us to use the metaphor of the multiverse as a tool, not as an end in itself. The modern resurgence of modal realism in the philosophy of physics illustrates how this tool can become a bridge to empirical science. The Everett interpretation, with its branching universes, can be seen as a physical instantiation of Lewis's worlds, but with an added twist. The worlds are not merely possible, but are dynamically generated by quantum processes. This move has led some philosophers, such as